Hello. In the early days of Warhammer, there was no Chaos Lord, evil sorcerer, or cruel lich as malevolently dangerous as Drachenfels. Known as the Great Enchanter, Drachenfels possessed all of the powers of magic, chaos, and necromancy combined. He was a big bad for the Warhammer world before Nagash even existed. And the first ever GW book, the first novel set in the Warhammer world, was all about him. Sort of. He was the bad guy, so it's not really about him, but he was definitely there. And because he's so welcoming and fun, it wouldn't be long before you could actually visit the home of Drachenfels in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. That supplement was Castle Drachenfels, and it was a funhouse dungeon like none other in the Warhammer world, like none other in the history of Games Workshop. An absolutely deadly meat grinder that would destroy player characters and leave no party intact by the end of it. So grab yourself a protective talisman of Sigmar, light up a torch, and let's get riding for the Grey Mountains, because we are going exploring. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're visiting Castle Drachenfels. I am currently in the throes of moving castle myself. Lots of boxes to pack, miniatures to protect, and books to put in boxes. But I couldn't let the spooky season pass without taking at least a few minutes to explore one of my favourite parts of the Warhammer world, an incredible bit of horror history in Games Workshop's game. This is going to be a quick Airbnb stopover in Castle Drachenfels. We're going to take a look at the history of the book, the supplement, and just a little bit about the creation of funhouse dungeons in the first place. Why did this supplement exist, and what was it really there to do?
Above them all, the fortress of Drachenfels stood against the crimson sky. Its 7 turrets thrust skywards like the taloned fingers of a deformed hand. The clifftop gates were, as ever, open like a maw in the side of the stone. Genevieve saw the eyes in the darkness beyond the gates, half-imagined, unwelcoming shapes flitting past innumerable windows, themselves shaped like eyes. This is where their adventure would end, in a castle as grey and jagged as the mountains around it, a fortress older than the Empire and darker than death, the lair of the Great Enchanter. Drachenfels was the first novel published by GW Books in 1989 and written by Kim Newman under the pseudonym he used for all of his Games Workshop writing, Jack Yeovil. It has a brilliant cover by Ian Miller and some fantastic internal art by Martin McKenna and David Gallagher. The novel tells the story of Oswald von Königswald, son of the Elector Count of Ostland, the noble vampire Genevieve, and the great playwright Detlef Sierck. The main body of the story takes place 25 years after Oswald's defeat of Drachenfels. To celebrate that anniversary, as well as the coronation of the new emperor, Karl Franz, Detlef has written a play called Drachenfels, and it will premiere in the ruined halls of the Great Enchanter's former residence. But those very walls of that castle have soaked up the evil essence of Drachenfels over the centuries, and a murderous mystery soon envelops the production. Like all of his writing for GW Books, Newman laced Drachenfels with subversion, humour, and homage. There is the obvious parallel to Bram Stoker's Dracula, both in the character of Drachenfels and the formidable castle he calls home. But there is also a timeless satire of fame, fortune, and fate at play as well. The book opens with a typical D&D dungeon crawl, an adventure following Oswald and his ragtag band of heroes out to prove themselves by defeating the greatest evil in the world, one that predates even the coming of the Slan millennia before. Almost immediately, Oswald's party realise just how much they have underestimated their quarry, and they are utterly decimated, many before they even reach the castle gates. But don't worry, because there are still plenty of folks left to get betrayed, ambushed, haunted, exploded, and otherwise defeated in the run-up to the encounter with the sorceress villain. And all of that is within the first 26 pages of the book, and there are plenty more stings in this tale. I came to the book Drachenfels regrettably late. I just didn't get around to reading it back in the day. I didn't read a lot of the fiction back when I first got started in Games Workshop. But I have since read it twice in the last couple of years,
because it was so darn good. You can watch my book club episode all about it if you want to hear my wider thoughts. But basically, this to me is the perfect Warhammer story. It's not so much about the battlefields, it's about the characters and the culture and the setting, the world itself and the people who inhabit it. So it really did something great, and I think it has so much humour and horror that it's just a terrific read. It really, really is. And that's why it's no surprise that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay would want to plunder it for content, and that they did. It didn't ever result in miniatures, sadly. There's no Drachenfels, there's no Oswald, there's no Genevieve the Vampire. But there are character profiles for the NPCs in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and some of the locations as well. And that was initially released in White Dwarf.
In issue 117, they provided character stats for Oswald, Genevieve, Detlef, and Drachenfels as well. Now, given that in the novel Drachenfels is extremely powerful, it's quite difficult to imagine when you could deploy him in a game of fantasy roleplay without there being a game-ending massacre as soon as you started rolling dice. But I do think it's very cool that he does exist in an official capacity for the game, even just as a threat for the players. White Dwarf would also detail a couple of locations from the book as well. The Great Hospice would feature in issue 130, a place where very old souls, like really, really old souls, can convalesce after a lifetime of adventure and or killing. And then in issue 122 of White Dwarf, you would get the details for the Prince Luitpold, the elegant luxury river liner that transports Genevieve along the Reich early in the book.
One of the hallmarks of the Jack Yeovil writing for Games Workshop, Kim Newman, the author's writing, was that there's lots of interconnected stories and characters and moments across his various pieces. You see that in his Dark Future series, where everything is connected, and you see it in his Warhammer Fantasy work as well. Although Drachenfels, as a novel, is the only complete story he told about Drachenfels and those characters, there are lots of short stories that interweave, that have prequel elements, where we see characters appearing in different places and at different times. And one of those would actually feature in White Dwarf as well, before it ended up in an anthology for GW Books. That was No Gold in the Grey Mountains, and it's a prequel about one of the characters in the book.
The sunset bloodied the castle, as Constant Drachenfels, the Great Enchanter, had done in life. Joe Lamprecht had heard all of the stories, all the songs. He knew of the long-lived monster's numberless crimes, and of his eventual downfall and defeat. Brave Prince Oswald and fair Genevieve, his vampire ladylove, had ended the horror, and now the castle was untenanted, all but the most earthbound ghosts flown to the beyond. However, it was still shunned. No peasant of this mountain region would dare set his boot upon the path to Drachenfels, while the stories were told in whispers, the songs remembered by ill-favoured minstrels. And that was what made the place ideal for Joe's purposes.
That's all well and good. I hear you scream. We've heard about Drachenfels, we've heard about this castle, but when do we get to visit it? Well, in 1992, Games Workshop released Castle Drachenfels, the supplement for WFRP, and that would give you everything you would need to venture forth to the most dangerous dungeon in the Warhammer world.
Castle Drachenfels was written by renowned WFRP writer Carl Sargent. Sargent was a trained psychologist who had worked in the field of parapsychology and the study of the paranormal. He had long been a Dungeons & Dragons fan, and in time he worked on a range of modules for D&D, particularly for the Greyhawk setting. He also wrote a number of game books for the Fighting Fantasy series under the pseudonym Keith Martin. I quite enjoyed playing his game book solo adventure set in the Warhammer world, Night of Mystery, that was published in White Dwarf 106. With the publication of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Sargent became a key member of the development team, working on several supplements for the Enemy Within campaign, like Warhammer City and Empire in Flames. And he also worked on a number of one-off releases, like Restless Dead and The Lichmaster, a WFRP adaptation of one of the earliest Warhammer Fantasy battle scenarios, Terror of the Lichmaster, which featured Heinrich Kemmler. Before going on to work on Shadowrun and more D&D modules in the 90s, Sargent would complete one last WFRP supplement, Castle Drachenfels.
The back of the Castle Drachenfels book describes it as an adventure for experienced adventurers, which, despite its near tautological structure, is a reasonable description, I suppose, but I actually take issue with it on two counts. One, is that it's not really an adventure at all. It's more of a collection of locations and NPCs, traps, puzzles, monsters and creatures, all of the good stuff that you can fill an adventure with, and some hooks to get you started, but not a full end-to-end adventure itself. And then the experienced bit, well, yes, you do have to have experienced adventurers to run this adventure, but they need to be more than just experienced. They need to basically be gods amongst men. They need to be at the very height of their powers, because this dungeon will kill you.
At first, Constant Drachenfels used his own diverse and personal magics to record these perversions for his own languorous contemplations. But over time, the very stone of the castle itself began to listen, to record, to respond, to change. Drachenfels found that he who listened correctly could see, hear, smell, and even taste every act of wickedness that took place within the chambers and warrens of the building. And he who allowed his mind to wander found that the castle was only too happy to guide it for him, and to draw a little of the sensations and memories of that mind into itself, as if it too mulled over those things that stirred the black hearts within its walls.
So why would an RPG want to create a straight-up dungeon-crawling killing machine in the first place? Well, to answer that question, we need to take a little bit of a divergence into D&D territory.
In 1977, the Judges Guild published Teagle Manor to be used with Dungeons & Dragons. It was one of the earliest role-playing dungeons ever released. The 24-page game aid details Sir Runic the Rump, who wants to sell the family seat, but first needs adventurers to remove all 100 of his corrupted dead ancestors from the property. We've all been there. The adventure became one of the Judges Guild's most successful D&D products, and it would be reprinted and expanded many times. In White Dwarf issue 3, reviewer Don Turnbull said, "I have been fortunate enough to play this scenario and found it enjoyable, not wildly suspenseful or nail-bitingly exciting, but a novel change from the more familiar dungeon setting. Some of the monsters do not quite ring true, but after all, we could hardly expect the designer to fill a haunted house entirely with undead and ghosts."
RPG historian Steve Horvath, in his 2023 book Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground, described some of the impact of Teagle Manor.
Teagle Manor is what has become known as a funhouse dungeon. That categorization comes with the assumption that making sense is not a primary goal. The result is a creation of unpredictable environments for players, who are kept guessing at every closed door and laughing around the play table, even as their characters suffer increasingly improbable demises.
Horvath even goes on to explore how the origins of Teagle Manor and its funhouse design may have influenced the mega dungeons that we see today in video games like the Dark Souls series. I think it is a really interesting exploration, but there is another pioneering work that was happening around about the same time as the creation of Teagle Manor, one that was being developed by Gary Gygax in TSR's D&D line.
Gygax, the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, created the Tomb of Horrors in 1975, a dungeon so deadly as to be a lesson in humility for players who thought they could take anything dungeon masters could throw at them. Initially written for use at conventions, Gygax wrote about its creation in the foreword to a much later sequel to the Tomb. It was a long time ago when the Tomb of Horrors first made its appearance. Before I put it into manuscript form for publication, I carried the scenario around with me in my briefcase, so as to be ready for those fans who boasted of having mighty PCs able to best any challenge offered by the AD&D game. After an hour or so, the players whose characters were survivors typically remembered suddenly that they had pressing engagements elsewhere. Clutching their precious character sheets, they fled the table. 2 years later, in 1977, the same year that Teagle Manor was published, the Tomb would be reworked and released as an official module for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It would be revised and re-released again and again, accumulating a reputation as the pinnacle of a very specific type of role-playing dungeon, one where DMs and GMs fully embraced an antagonistic aspect of their role, pushing, poking, and punishing players, and forcing them to solve the dungeon through trial, error, and death. In his 10 out of 10 review of the Tomb in White Dwarf issue 13, Don Turnbull said, "The adventurers presumably hope to gain riches from the quest, but there is a more than even chance that all they gain will be their deaths. for this module is sprinkled extensively with subtle, insidious, and carefully laid traps, and it will be a fortunate adventurer who manages to avoid them. As for the module itself, it is very hard, and will be hard for the DM to learn in advance, though this is an essential prerequisite of running it properly.
The lasting success of funhouse dungeons like Teagle Manor and the Tomb of Horrors have done much to prove the case for this sort of dangerous, PC-shattering dungeon crawl supplement. These modules that bring gleeful joy to GMs and are punishing challenges for players. There is a case to be made that some people enjoy playing them. They're popular enough. At least they were in the 80s and 90s. Perhaps not so popular now. But that did not stop a range of different RPG publishers from creating their own equivalents of the Tomb of Horrors for their own RPGs.
So you got adventures like the Tomb of Ayuchaban for Legend of the Five Rings, a death trap as brutal as the Tomb of Horrors, though one with some brilliant ideas in it that I would love to chat about in more detail at some point. It's a prison constructed to house the remains of the most dangerous necromancer in Rokugan history, but of course, like Drachenfels, he's slowly been reforming and the tomb has been corrupted by his presence. There are physical and ingenious mental traps which are all but guaranteed to kill PCs, and the story to it all is fantastic.
And that, of course, brings us to Wuthrup and the Castle Drachenfels, which is quite a nice closed loop in a way, because the start of the Drachenfels novel, that first couple of chapters, is essentially a funhouse dungeon from D&D played out in the prose. The characters get absolutely rinsed, decimated by traps in a dungeon, and very few of them make it through to the final encounter. And that is what inspired the Castle Drachenfels RPG supplement. It is absolutely recreating just that portion of the book, and that portion of the book is recreating the Tomb of Horrors, essentially. So that makes a lot of sense.
With every horror, the Poison Feast of 1907 being one of the most infamous, Castle Drachenfels seems to draw more vileness into itself. The building grew more deformed, the illusions and deceptions more difficult to detect, the nightmares and hauntings more intense. Souls, and worse, the remains of souls, thronged the castle as flies swarm around a carcass. Constant Drachenfels is said to have boasted that he kept all the souls of his victims in some form or other within his home. If this is so, it would explain many of the experiences of those who have sojourned there. Like Teagle Manor's haunted house and Tomb of Horrors' trap-filled dungeon, Castle Drachenfels would be filled by Sergeant with all manner of exceedingly deadly and wonderfully creative, horrifying challenges.
Now, I must be honest here. I have never actually played through the Castle Drachenfels adventure, either as a GM or as a player. I've never got it to the table, sadly. Even though I'm pretty confident that I would hate playing it in the sense of, I don't really enjoy that Tomb of Horrors funhouse dungeon style of play. I'm not here to be challenged by the dungeon and the ingenuity of the traps. I enjoy the story of it. I enjoy the sort of broader storytelling collaborative experience when I roleplay with my friends. However, having read through Castle Drachenfels, there is a lot of stuff in here that I think is really, really fun, and given the context of the Great Enchanter's castle, this is the big bad guy of Warhammer at the time, it absolutely makes sense that it is so deadly. I'm not going to go through everything that's in the castle, but I am going to call out just a couple of my favourite examples. Some fun rooms, some fun traps, and some fun moments.
First off, I ought to mention the cover, which features a sublime bit of John Blanche art that is variously named as the Ogre's Tower or Hrothjog's Tower, as in the Jez Goodwin ogre mercenary called Hrothjog, which of course means it is not Castle Drachenfels at all, just a reused piece of Warhammer art. But I think it can be forgiven, as it does portray the exact right sense of foreboding that Drachenfels' home ought to have. Internal line art is not credited in the book, but there's definitely some more Martin McKenna stuff in here, as well as the likes of Adrian Smith, and it's all suitably atmospheric early Warhammer stuff. It's great to look at, and it's just fantastically evocative of the horrors within. Before you even get to the castle, there's some creepy encounters to be had. Stuff like spectral visitations, ravenous harpies, and wandering orcs. The hooks for getting players to the castle in the first place also provide some neat pre-castle potential too, with curses, treasure hunts, and noble quests to prevent the return of Drachenfels, all presenting reasonable excuses to get players into this hellish house. But it is once you are in the castle that the high strangeness kicks up a gear, and the relentless, deadly, and damnable obstacles and enemies become a real challenge. Whether it's chaos cultists on their own weird quests, magical marionettes that hurl insults, or zombies that dismember themselves and cook their own body parts, things can go from unsettlingly amusing to truly gruesome body horror really quick. And that is before you consider the countless spirits, skeletons, demons, elementals, skeleton warriors, possessed furniture, and skeleton dinosaurs that will pursue you throughout this dungeon. I'm particularly partial to the gargoyle corridor that has been recreated from the original novel, a nightmarish place where the walls come alive and grasp, grab, and grapple you to your stone-cold death. There is also a giant floating Baron Harkonnen-style fat man who is feeding raw meat to skeleton slaves, and it's weird. The book provides a ground floor map of the castle, but it also makes clear that GMs would do well to play with the geography and nature of the building in order to disorientate and enfear players' perceptions. Sargent has populated the rooms with characterful, if somewhat disjointed, descriptions and encounters. There are constant threats, some mundane, some outlandish, all deadly, and it very much conforms to that funhouse dungeon design. The thing that connects all of the rooms is basically that they're evil and want the players dead, and the puzzles that need solving to progress to the dark heart of the castle dungeon remind me of early survival horror games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. They have a certain warped logic that is only really acceptable because of the atmosphere of the place. Speaking of warped things, there are passageways and portals that can randomly teleport PCs around the castle, in some cases even taking them from penultimate rooms of the dungeon right the way back to the castle gates, which I cannot imagine dealing with the frustration of a player who has gone through that. A better result though, I suppose, than being transported to the Chaos Wastes, which can also happen. Truth be told, the Castle Drachenfels is not really like any other Warhammer Fantasy roleplay adventure. It is an old-school D&D dungeon crawl, and I am really glad that it both exists, but it's also one of a kind. To have the option to visit a meat-grinding funhouse is great, and it works perfectly with the trappings of Drachenfels as a story and a villain. But there's a reason it's never been a priority for me to get to the table. There's plenty of other WFRP I want to play first. That doesn't mean I wouldn't love to visit Castle Drachenfels one day though at the table, especially if Cubicle 7 could find a way to update it for the 4th edition. Who knows, maybe it would make for a fun one-off live stream, something like that, because this is such an atmospheric, horrifying, funny at times adventure that would be well worth spending time in with friends. The WFRP supplement was the only real outing for Drachenfels in the Warhammer games. We wouldn't see him in the setting beyond the Jack Yeovil novels, and we wouldn't see him on the tabletop. There's no miniatures to play with, no units that represent any of his forces. None of the heroes made it into miniatures either, sadly. So it's a real shame. It's kind of a bittersweet moment. This, from such an incredible novel, this is the only way in which to interact with it in-game. Now, as I say, there are NPCs from White Dwarf and other locations from the book that you can use. They make a lot of sense and they work really well in WFRP campaigns. But in order to play out something that feels like the story from the Drachenfels book, it's quite tough. You can only do the start of it and little bits throughout. You can't really capture that sort of epic horror sort of mystery from specific Drachenfels content. But of course, that is something that WFRP does naturally anyway. There's lots of thrills, there's horror, there's cults, there's chaos. It's all there to use. You just have to do a bit more work to bring it together. But besides the tabletop, there have been other examples of Drachenfels turning up and having a bit of fun. In 2020, the infamous castle would live again with the release of The Curse of Drachenfels DLC for the Vermintide 2 video game. I've not checked it out in detail, so I don't know how faithfully it recreates the castle halls, but I believe you can hear Drachenfels whisper and taunt throughout, and there are at least a few gargoyles scattered here and there. There was also a subtle appearance for Drachenfels in the End Times, sort of, which is a nice nod to the legacy of the book, but also begs the question whether a character appearance is really a character appearance if they have a different name or indeed are nameless and don't remember who they are or where they're from.
So there we go. That's all the time we've got. We need to check out of Castle Drachenfels now. I hope that you have had an enchanting stay. It was really fun to spend just a few minutes taking a look at what I think is a really fun corner of the Warhammer world. One that I think is a shame it's sort of disappeared. I guess, given that the old world is set 200 years before what was the end of the Warhammer world's timeline, this would still see Drachenfels at large. So perhaps we might see him involved in something in the old world at some point. I think that would be really, really fun. Such a cool, unexplored corner, thing that you can bring into the Warhammer tabletop game that hasn't really been explored before. I think that would be really super fun. So that is something I would love to see in the old world. If we don't ever get that, we've still got Castle Drachenfels for WFRP, we've still got that incredible novel, and we've still got homebrew adventures that take advantage of Jack Yeovil, his amazing storytelling. So I'm happy. Don't forget to leave a review on TripAdvisor about Castle Drachenfels and your stay. Don't forget to leave a comment on this video, subscribe, like, and share. It's all enormously helpful. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Right, Martha, back to packing boxes for us. You've got to put all your toys away.